one option a Mr. Cenk Uygur is exploring is the presidency, even though he was not born in the US, right? And so he's got court cases over this. He's appealing to secretaries of state, trying to get on the ballot in various states with mixed results. And a one court case was already against him. And I think a lot of people hear about this and their first blush reaction is, no, he wasn't born in the US. So how
Right.
could the president, right? It's something that we're taught in grade school. In fact, I even saw him say that when he tells people he became a naturalized citizen, that he wasn't born here, but he later became a citizen, that they laugh at him. The first thing that everyone says to him is, haha, you can't be president, right? So this comes
That's an odd reaction to say the first thing to someone.
yeah, but I believe it though.
Say, hey, congratulations.
But I do
Oh,
believe it, right?
sucker.
I've heard that throughout my life too. Not directed at me, obviously. I was born here, but you know, when someone says that, it's like, because that's what we think of based on our
Right.
education, right? When we think
Right.
of becoming a citizen, we think, oh, you could become a citizen, you could vote, but you can't be president. Like, that's the one thing you can't do, right? Because you can basically do everything else the citizen can,
Right.
but you just
Right.
can't be president, right? That's just our understanding of things.
Right.
So, and that comes from the Constitution, right? It's not made up. It's not
Right.
a conspiracy. The let's pull it up right here. Section 1 of Article 2. No person except a natural born citizen or a citizen of the U.S. at the time of the adoption of the Constitution shall be eligible to the office of president.
Right.
No person except a natural born citizen. Then they talk about having to be 35 years old and 14 years a resident. But
Right.
the natural born citizen part has been subject to much debate and wasn't ever really definitively ruled upon, right? People sometimes get that confused also. The Supreme Court never issued a ruling on what that means to be a natural born citizen. A lot of people have understood that to mean you have to be born in the US. However, most constitutional scholars, I believe, interpret it as you have to be born a citizen of the US. Doesn't matter where you were born, but when you were born, you had to be a citizen. And in fact, there have been people who ran for president, not successfully, but who have ran for president before who were not born in the US. Ted Cruz comes to mind, born in
Cruz.
Canada. Mitt
Yeah.
Romney's father, George Romney, born in Mexico, right? John McCain, you might even throw in there, born in the Panama Canal Zone, I believe under US territory, but not physically in the US. So, but still
Right.
born, you know, all these folks were born US citizens because of their parents. So if it went to the Supreme Court, would they have decided against these candidates? Maybe. You know, maybe if Ted Cruz became the Republican nominee, maybe if George Romney had become the Republican nominee, the Supreme Court would have ruled them ineligible. I tend to think they wouldn't. And we can get cynical again and say maybe depends on the politics of the court at the time. You know, I don't know.
Sure.
But broadly speaking, I don't think that they would have been held ineligible. I think that being born a US citizen is a natural born citizen.
Right. Right.
So I think that's a bit of a misnomer when people say you have to be born in the US, but again, hasn't been really tested.
Right.
With Cenk Uygur, I'll get ahead.
I know, go ahead. No, I was gonna
Oh,
say that. That's what I was gonna say.
so he's
That
trying to take it a step further.
right. Yeah, to say that uh now I don't know what his rationale is, right? Because it does clearly say be a natural born citizen, which he
Right.
clearly was
He
not.
was not.
So I'm not sure what his angle is to try
All
to
right. So I'll tell you, he's going back to the 14th Amendment. Obviously, a different part of the amendment, right? Not the insurrection clause that we were just talking about,
right.
but he is going to the equal protection clause of the 14th Amendment. In fact, if you look at Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, it says all persons born or naturalized in the U.S. and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the U.S. and of the state where they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the U.S., nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So he's saying that the 14th Amendment, which was obviously passed well after the rest of the Constitution, right? This comes post-Civil War, overrides that initial part of the Constitution. Article 2, Section 1. He's saying that the 14th Amendment overrides that because it says that you can't deny naturalized citizens of the equal protection of the laws. Essentially, you can't discriminate against someone who is a naturalized citizen, and this is discrimination. There are problems with his argument, however. I'll say that.
Yeah, I can see how someone could look at that and be like, okay, this is an opportunity to argue this point. I can see that. But there's also, I think it's open to say that it's not in conflict because of the term natural born citizen.
Right. Well, the court, actually, I think it was in South Carolina, but the decision that came out not long ago that said that he was ineligible for the ballot talked about how these provisions of the Constitution are not in conflict because the 14th Amendment doesn't specifically contradict the provisions of Article 2. So they're saying that, he's trying to twist it basically so that they're in
Right.
conflict, but the constitutional provision, the original provision, talks about the requirements for president, and they're very specific about the requirements for president. The 14th
Right.
Amendment has nothing to do with that. So he's trying to take a general term about discrimination and apply it to a specific term about the
Right.
qualifications for president and say that they don't mesh. The other thing is, he's kind of conflating different provisions of Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. So it starts off by saying all persons born or naturalized in the U.S. are citizens of the U.S. and of the state where they reside. Okay, well, no one is denying that. No one is saying that he's not a citizen of the U.S. or of the state where he resides. So
Right.
he wants it that the equal protection part should apply. That's the bottom. If you keep reading, right, it's actually the last thing it talks about in that section. It says any person within its jurisdiction, in other words, of the U.S. and the states, shall not be deprived of equal protection of the laws. Any person. So that really has nothing to do with the naturalized citizen part. Really nothing to do with that. Any person can't be denied equal protection. And so if that's your argument, then your equal protection clause, that would really be the same as saying someone who wasn't a citizen at all should be able to run because it's a discrimination.
Right.
You're discriminating against non-citizens, right? It's equal
Right.
protection. It applies to all persons. And
Right.
so it's not just naturalized citizens. Really has nothing to do with equal protection. You know what
Right.
I mean? And so really his argument would have to be it's a discrimination against anyone to say they can't run for president. But, that
Right.
would hold. There are qualifications and the court's not going to say anyone can run for president because then you can go back to age. You could make an argument for age, but when it comes to equal protection, there are different standards depending on the class of person. And so age, as far as I know, is still subject to rational basis review. It doesn't get that heightened scrutiny, but natural origin does get heightened scrutiny, certainly. So you can make that argument. Someone born in Canada or Mexico or anywhere in South America or anywhere around the world but the U.S. and who's not a citizen should be able to run. Why? Because under the Equal Protection Clause,
Right.
national origin gets heightened scrutiny, it gets strict scrutiny. And so basically any discrimination against them is presumptively unconstitutional. Therefore, the qualifications for president shouldn't apply to them. That would be the same argument, basically, right? Him being
Right.
naturalized, as far as I can tell, has nothing to do with it. And so I think it's a poor argument.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know, I wouldn't want to say what he thinks, but I think part of it is probably publicity. Um, he's been around long enough to know that it's an uphill battle. And so
Right.
I think again, like just like Vivek and you're raising your visibility in the public. I think part of that comes into play with it. So yeah, and I personally I don't think I don't think his case should succeed in that regard. I think that is a good provision to have to be a natural born citizen in the country. So we'll see how that plays out. But I think ultimately he knows he's going to lose because here's the thing. If it does, let's say it gets to the Supreme Court. Do you think the conservative Supreme Court is going to allow him on the ballot? Absolutely not.
No.
Absolutely not. And I think he knows he's been around long enough. He's smart enough to know that he would not be able to win in the Supreme Court.
I don't know. Is he that smart to know that? Is he a lawyer?
I think he is.
I don't think
I
he's
don't
a
know if he's a
lawyer.
lawyer.
But
But I think he's been around politics
no,
and covering things long enough. He knows this.
but allowing him on the ballot wouldn't just mean he could be on the ballot. It would open the floodgates to really certainly any naturalized citizen, but maybe even more than that, right? Maybe even
Absolutely.
anyone, from any country, any citizen of anywhere. Because
Absolutely.
again, if you're making an equal protection argument, it's not
Right.
about being a naturalized citizen. The equal protection applies to all persons. It doesn't say you have to be a naturalized citizen to get equal protection. That's the fundamental flaw in his argument, aside from the fact that the 14th Amendment really isn't applicable to Article 2, because Article 2 talks about the qualifications for president, and the 14th Amendment is not about that.
Right.
Let's talk about the insurrection clause, which again now that's being debated in other cases as to its applicability to the presidency. But you have to look at what these provisions are actually applying to. And when you have different constitutional provisions, courts are reluctant to invalidate one provision of the Constitution as contradicting another unless there is a clear contradiction, right? It wants to be able to read both of them as not contradictory and say this applies to the qualifications for president, this applies to other things. But unless they are inherently contradictory or specifically contradictory, the court wants to let them both live.
Yeah.
So they're gonna be very reluctant to say the 14th Amendment contradicts or supersedes the Article 2 qualifications for president. You know,
I wonder. It's a slight. I wonder. Part of it is to be it says to be what 14-year resident or something like that. I
yeah,
wonder if that would disqualify me since I haven't lived in the States in like 10 years. Would that
yes,
disqualify me, or could it be read as 14 consecutive years recently, or it could just be 14 years total? Because I've lived more than 14 years in the States, but just the last 10, I haven't been in there.
yeah. I'm not sure if there was actually any precedent on that point. My
Hmm.
understanding of it has been you have to be a resident for the past 14 years, because I don't think they want someone to be born in the US, move out, let's say at the age of 14, and live their whole life in another country and then come back and run for president immediately, right? But that would be subject to statutory interpretation. You would probably look at other similar statutes around the country. I know, for example, in New York, when you're talking about running for assembly or state senate, you have to be a resident of your district, generally speaking, for a year. It has to be the year prior to the election. It can't be just any year of your life.
Hmm.
And I believe it's a resident of the state for 5 years, if I'm not mistaken.
Hmm.
Again, it needs to be the immediate 5 years precedent to that. So that's
Hmm.
usually how they go. But you can start comparing and contrasting the land. Again, this is what lawyers and judges do. They look at the language of the statutes, right, and of the provisions, and they try to draw differences. They say, oh, well, these all say this. This one isn't worded that way. How come? Right? Maybe that's significant. And they start debating it.
Well, I think I'm gonna join. I'm gonna join with this guy and be like, you know what, man, they're barring us all. I need to get back to eligibility. And one clarification, it looks like he actually got his JD from Columbia University.
Okay, so he has a JD.
Yeah.
I don't know if he's a practicing attorney.
According to the chat, what is it? He worked briefly in '96 as an associate attorney at a law firm in DC and then one in New York. So, I mean, I think he's aware of it, and so he would definitely be aware of the argument that's being taken place, but also what he would face in the Supreme Court. And even if he didn't have his JD, like I said, he's been around long enough. He's not a stupid man. Um, he'd be aware of it.
So I just found this and doing some quick research here. Herbert Hoover, apparently, from what I'm seeing here, lived in London from 1910 to 1917. And when he ran for election in 1928, he had only lived in the US for 11 years upon his return, but he had the 14 years total and he wasn't disqualified. Now,
Oh,
was that tested in court? I don't know. Maybe they just let it go or assumed that it would be
right,
okay. I don't know if that was actually ever tested, but
right,
at least there is precedent now for you to say, well, if you disqualify me, then that means Herbert Hoover wasn't eligible all along, also, right?
right, right. I think these days the way it's very polarized, it would
Yeah,
be tested. Someone
probably,
would, yeah.
probably.
I mean, because they even brought it up when Ted Cruz ran, um, and then they questioned, well, Obama, this and that, and like it would definitely be tested by someone on one party. If I'm
Yeah,
running as a Democrat, Republicans like, no, we don't want him on the ballot, so we're going to test that. Even if I say I ran as a Republican, some Democrats might probably want to test that as well. So I don't know.
right. And the funny thing about that whole Obama controversy was even if it turned out he wasn't born in the US, he would still have been born a
Right,
natural born citizen and still would be eligible to be president. And so
right.
that really didn't even matter. Right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It was clear nonsense. So,
Um, yeah. And, one thing you could also do, I feel like I'm giving you free legal advice now for when you run for president, but you could look at the statutes in other states. For example, I believe in New York, the actual law is going to talk about being in your district for the 12 months immediately preceding the election. Whereas you saw in
right,
the Constitution, it doesn't say that, right? It just says a resident for 14
right.
years. And so you can say, well, how come in those other places where they're trying to keep it so that you have to be there immediately before the election, they make that very clear, but they kind of kept it more broad or vague in the Constitution.
Yeah,
You can make that
yeah.
argument that when they want to ensure that you live there right before the election, they say that specifically, but they didn't say that here.
Right, right.
Um,
Yeah. I mean, and those guys on what people like Thomas Jefferson and whatnot, they went back and forth and at the time. They wouldn't want to exclude themselves, I'm sure. So
oh yeah, yeah.
yeah,
That's
I
yeah, that's true. But
so hey, look, you heard here. This is my announcement. I'm running for president. Put me in as a write-in candidate, and yeah, let's get it. We've got work to do.
oh, you're taking taking the tagline too. All right.
Word up.
uh,
So maybe should we put that as the poll?
yeah, let's do it.
Yeah.
I just want to say I was going back to Article 2, Section 1 for a second because you mentioned people like Thomas Jefferson, because they did have something in there about people who were U.S. citizens at the time the Constitution was adopted, right?
Mm.
Because they weren't all natural born back in those days. At that time, remember, this is pre-amendments, right? This is
Right, 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 right.
so.
Because
This is,
he lived in Europe for a little while too, Jefferson.
but yeah, because wasn't he ambassador to France or something like that too?
Something like that.
Uh, Article. I just wanted to see Article 2. Go back to Article 2, Section 1. I don't know why I'm getting all this commentary. I just want to see the actual text. Okay, here it is. Okay. No person except a natural born citizen or a citizen of the U.S. at the time of the adoption of this Constitution shall be eligible to office of president. Neither shall any person be eligible to that office who shall not have attained the age of 35 and been 14 years a resident. Okay, so even that 14-year provision would apply to people at that time who were not born citizens, right? People who just were citizens at the time of the adoption of the Constitution. They themselves were subject to the 14-year requirement. So yeah,
Mm.
that gives you further, I think, justification, right? Further support for your cause that the 14 years could be anytime throughout your life. It's kind of weird.
All right.
Yeah, you just have to
All
like
right.
do your time, like a 14-year bid in the U.S.
Right, right. But I mean, and it kind of makes sense. You wouldn't want someone just coming in from another country because especially, I mean, imagine if it was just open to anybody. You could imagine, for example, Putin would be putting plants
Oh yeah,
in the States. Any government, actually, any other government would be putting plants in it. Israel, Russia, any of these would try to be putting people in to get them into presidency to have favorability towards their countries.
right. But isn't that kind of what Uyghur is trying to open the door to? Maybe not deliberately, but
Right.
saying that anyone can run, even people who weren't born citizens, or
Right. That would be, yeah, if the way that, it sounds like he's arguing it, it would kind of open the door to that possibility.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Well, shout out to our boy Isaac, who recently became a citizen. So
all right,
if Uygur has his way, then maybe he can be president one day too.
true, true, word up.
So, all right, let's do it. The poll question of the week is: do you believe that naturalized citizens who were not born US citizens should be eligible to run for president?
Mm. I predict, mark my words, the majority of people are going to say no.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Even on a more progressive friendly site, maybe people who are aware, maybe they're followers of the Young Turks, they're still going to say
yeah,
no. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I think so. I
All
think
right.
that's, I think the majority of Americans on whichever side would probably say no to that. The exception might be the younger generation. The current younger generation
Mm.
might not agree with it. Might say, "Oh no, this should be allowed. Anyone should be able to be." I would think
Right.
so.
I mean, there is a movement to allow non-citizens to vote, right? We're seeing
Yeah.
that take various
Right.
forms. So maybe people who believe that might be more apt to go
Right.
this.
So,
I don't know.
well,
Some people
before
might look
we
at it
wrap
as
up,
unfair, right? Like you can't help where you were born. But
yeah, that's true. But yeah, I get that. But it's still. I think that's where you would probably still get the majority of people who would agree that you know only natural born citizens should be eligible.
and probably a lot of disagreement about what a natural born citizen is.
Yeah. Well, what do you mean by natural? What if
Right. No, I
someone
mean
was what if
it
someone
goes
was born via artificial insemination, or if it was a cesarean? Is that
yeah,
natural
oh
born?
right. No, but it also just goes back to that you have to be born physically in the US or just born a US citizen. I think a lot of
Right,
people
right.
that distinction. But yeah, you're right. I mean, someone asked me not long ago, do I think that AI will ever be elected president? I said Alan
Right.
Iverson.
Right.
So hey,
So, I mean, he was natural born, so he's got the opportunity. He could dunk on the competition.
that's right. This is the world we live in.